Greetings, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Kali Akuno um, with the Institute for Social Ecology, also with Cooperation Jackson. And today we're bringing you part three of our ongoing series about the Sudan and the revolution and counter-revolution, which is currently taking place there. Today we have a friend and comrade, Nesreen El-Amin, who's going to be joining us today to talk about the international kind of dimensions of this conflict. The different forces that have been arrayed at pushing forward the counter-revolution, which is what, I think anybody who's been following this series is how I've been trying to position people to think about it and to put it in a particular context. And today we want to bring out, the international dimensions of this and, why and how it's continuing to be stoked. So it's an honor to have Nesreen here, who's been studying these questions for many moons, and to bring, their experience and analysis to all of us. So welcome, Nisreen. Good to see you again and be with you again.
Thank you
Uh,
so much for having me. It's good to see you.
so just to let everybody know, because our folks will be joining us, throughout how we typically do it. We're going to go roughly until about 5 o'clock with just a dialogue between me and Nesreen, and then take questions from everybody primarily through the chat. But you can post questions at any point in the chat. If something pops in your head and you don't want to lose it, just put it in the chat feature and we'll go from there. And again, thanks everybody for participating. So yeah, Nisreen, let's just jump into it, right? The the first fundamental question that I wanted us to just get started off of was, you know, 2018 started with the ouster of the Bashir regime. But I think it's fundamental to first kind of lay out like who were the international forces that were allied with Bashir that allowed him to stay in power, helped him to stay in power for 30, something years. For us to get a clear understanding of that, then who were the corporate sponsors of his regime, and what were their respective interests? What role did, if any, did like the multilateral institutions like the UN or the World Bank or IMF play? Because we know those are major players on the scene always in the backdrop of all of these struggles. So I wanted you to just lay that out so our audience has a kind of a clear understanding of what transpired during the revolution and what is, later on, what's transpiring during the counter revolution.
Okay, yeah, thank you. That's a really important question, and I'm glad we're kind of starting there instead of later. And yeah, I just as a footnote, I just wanted to say I think somebody needs to do a study of the role of the IMF as a counter-revolutionary force and as a kind of trigger also of popular uprisings on the continent, because they played a role, like, for example, in the 1985 Intifada that overthrew a military regime as well in Sudan. So anyway, I took notes because it's just easier for me, so forgive me. But so before I answer your question, I just wanted to say that I think it's important to understand the current war as a counter-revolutionary war as opposed to a purely internal power struggle between two factions of the military coup regime that took power in October of 2021, or merely as a proxy war. And I say this because I think the proxy war framing has some truth to it. It has helped people kind of highlight the role of external actors, which we'll be talking a lot about today, like the UAE, in profiting off and fueling this war. But it's not complete or fully accurate because it tends to minimize the role that military, state, and business elites have been playing for decades, really since independence, in using violence against civilians in marginalized areas of Sudan, particularly non-Arab communities, to extract resources and to consolidate their economic and political power. And of course, this process of extraction and consolidation of power has always required external actors who've used Sudanese natural and human resources to consolidate their own forms of kind of regional and national, and I would say kind of sub-imperial power, if you will. So I say all this to say that I think while I'll be talking about external players in Sudan's recent history, I think it's important to kind of think of them as international partners in a process of counter-revolution that serves to ultimately protect the interests of both domestic and international elites. Yeah, so I wanted to say that first. I also wanted to say, I don't know if I also wanted to say that, we can't really talk about any of this without talking about like external actors, without briefly touching on the colonial roots of state violence in Sudan. So Britain's kind of parting gift to Sudan at independence was an economy that was dependent on the exploitation of farmers and the extraction of cash crops like cotton, and a political system which was kind of reconfigured to serve the interests of a riverain northern and central Sudanese elite. And both of these systems developed at the expense of the masses in the south and other marginalized regions, but also of a rural population at the center who kind of sustained this extractive economy. And so as an example, the British, when they left Sudan in like the 1950s, they vacated 800 administrative seats, of which Sudan's new ruling elite allocated 6 to South Sudanese and 1 to Darfur, both areas the size of Texas with large populations in the millions. And the other 793 seats or so were occupied by sort of Arab and Nubian identified elites from the north and center. And similarly, Sudan was kind of considered a like remote outpost of the Ottoman Empire, and it was during this era that we saw slavery, which pre-existed this period, kind of expand and facilitate the development of a plantation economy, due partly to Ottoman taxation policies. And so you had like dispossessed Arab identified farmers becoming slave traders and capturing non-Arab people from other parts of the country and selling them to landed elites, some of whom had been rendered landless by them, right? And that legacy of slavery continues to kind of produce an afterlife and shapes how state violence kind of manifests itself. So, now I can kind of start answering your question. So yeah, I mean, I think starting with the Bashir regime, they assumed power in 1989 through a military coup. And in the immediate aftermath of that coup, they made sure to kind of destroy trade unions and civil society more broadly in order to kind of maintain their power. They emptied the kind of shrinking public sector and expanding private sector by kind of removing everybody that wasn't aligned with them, and kind of filling those positions with unqualified employees who belonged to the ruling Islamist party at the time. So there were massive layoffs as part of this process of kind of slowly gaining control over a large portion of the economy. And then meanwhile, they were kind of continuing the legacy of waging wars against primarily non-Arab communities in marginalized areas of the country, like what is now South Sudan, in order to suppress any kind of opposition, legitimate grievances around equitable resource distribution, political representation, and regional autonomy, and to continue kind of accumulating land and extracting resources. And this was all done under the ideological cloak of religious salvation, right? And so you had this kind of ethno-nationalist, monocultural, in this case Arab, right-wing religious project being imposed on a multiracial, multilingual, multi-religious country in very violent ways. And so, yeah, I think, so that kind of brings me to the 90s, right? And so I want to say in the 70s, oil was discovered by the Chevron Oil Company in what is now South Sudan, which of course at that time was part of Sudan. But it wasn't until the early 90s that it started getting extracted and refined. And by then, the Clinton administration, in 93, I believe, had imposed sanctions on the Bashir regime as a state sponsor of terrorism, primarily for harboring Osama bin Laden between 91 and 96. And those sanctions continued even after they extradited him following US pressure. So the first companies to explore and extract oil were the Canadian company called Arakis, the China National Petroleum Company, and Petronas, which is a state company from Malaysia, and then later on Talisman, which is also Canadian. And Talisman in particular, there was a kind of a little bit of a like campaign built around them because they were very much implicated in fueling and escalating the Second Civil War with the South in the 90s, which was a particularly violent period that killed an estimated 2 million, mostly South Sudanese civilians, many of whom died of forced starvation and lack of medical care. And they, along with another company called the London Group, that actually just a couple of months ago got an award here in Canada, they were implicated in the Second Civil War as well, and in providing the resources for the Bashir regime to fund a campaign of genocidal violence in Darfur that began in 2003, which I'm sure your other guests also talked about. Um, and, you know, which was kind of an extension of the same ideological, political, and economic project which we spoke about earlier, that was ultimately about brutally squashing popular and armed Darfurian resistance against the state after decades of government neglect, marginalization, and extractive violence. And so that resistance was initially nonviolent, but then after, you know, the state didn't respond, turned violent. And I think, you know, Ismail, I didn't listen to the other interview, but Ismail really kind of laid out the roots of the violence in Darfur, so I'm not going to go into that. But I do think it's important to understand it within the context of kind of mass displacement, resource extraction, and land dispossession. Yeah, so I just wanted to mention that. So now I'm going to shift to the 2000s. So in the early 2000s, there was kind of an accelerated shift to adopt neoliberal reforms and austerity measures in order to privatize the agricultural sector. And that was partly in anticipation of South Sudan's likely independence after the Comprehensive Peace Agreement was signed in 2005 that essentially ended the Second Civil War, because the regime was anticipating losing about 75% of its oil revenue because most of the oil fields were in the south. So the strategy became to privatize large state-run agricultural schemes in an attempt to attract foreign agribusiness investors mostly from within the Arab world, primarily kind of wealthy, resource-poor Gulf states. And that's kind of, these are the investments that I actually study. So for instance, there was a law that was passed in 2005 to begin privatizing the Jazeera scheme, which until then had been one of the largest centrally managed kind of irrigation schemes started by the British to kind of extract cotton for the empire. And this law was developed in accordance with recommendations issued by the World Bank, and that's really important here, on how to make the agricultural sector more efficient and productive. And so the Bashir regime started withdrawing agricultural extension services, water provision, like engineering and equipment support to small farmers upon the recommendation of the World Bank, which plunged many into debt and forced them to sell their land at like very much below market prices to the government, who then turned around and sold it, or leased it, I should say, not sold it, to foreign investors. And they weren't necessarily successful in the area that encompassed the scheme because farmers got organized. And I think the article that I shared with you highlights some of this organizing, but they did manage to lease over 5 million of Sudan's most fertile land to foreign investors, primarily Saudis and Emiratis. And so over the last decades, what I've calculated is that they've invested, combined, the Saudis and Emiratis, about 27 billion in Sudanese land, real estate, infrastructure. And until the war, they controlled more Sudanese land than all of Sudan's large investment, like domestic investors combined. And their investments, like in combination with those domestic investments, really restructured the agricultural sector and food production more broadly, because small farmers couldn't compete and began selling land to local medium-sized investors. So they kind of expanded this like capitalist class of agribusiness, of domestic agribusiness elites. And it changed people's own food security because there was now less subsistence farming, people increasingly farming on other people's land and traveling seasonally to do so, and depending more on imports, right? Whether local or like from the Gulf. So I'm going to give you an example, the dairy industry. Many of the farms run by the Emiratis and Saudis, but also by some of the large domestic ones, produce mostly just animal feed, like not food, but feed for like dairy production. And it gets exported to the Gulf, where they produce dairy products that then get resold to us across the Middle East and North Africa. And because these farms encompass large tracts of land, they cut off the grazing, and they're like, you know, fenced off and stuff. They cut off the grazing routes of herders who make a living selling raw milk products and now have to compete with these packaged dairy products, both domestically produced and some from the Gulf. And so they're losing their livelihoods. And some are being recruited into the ever expanding security state as kind of foot soldiers, including now the RSF. Despite they having their own kind of grievances and decades-long contentious relationship with the state. And so that's, I think, some of the important context for understanding why a region once hailed as the breadbasket of the Middle East, even though that project failed, is now experiencing a widespread famine when it actually could feed itself, right? And so, yeah, I just wanted to kind of mention that. And then, yeah, maybe let's see. Okay, yeah, and let me just skip forward to I wanted to talk a little bit about climate change and ecology, but maybe we'll sort of the ecological damage that that has caused, but maybe we'll touch on that later. So briefly, and I'm almost done with this part. In the 2010s, there was a kind of that was kind of the post-oil era. We saw Turkey, Russia, and some of the Gulf states vying for access to the Red Sea for strategic, military, and economic reasons. We have a fairly long kind of Red Sea coast. So, for example, Erdogan of Turkey signed a deal to, quote, restore a Red Sea port to its Ottoman glory, and even accused British colonizers of having neglected it after they turned Sudan into a colony, and that, like a shaved beard, they would grow it again or something like that. And it was both deeply colonial, but also meant to appeal to the kind of Islamist logic or ideology of the regime. So he came in like December of 2017, I think it was. He received an honorary doctorate from the University of Khartoum. And then they signed this deal. The island had been a kind of important imperial port during the Ottoman Empire. And, you know, people, of course, protested and the deal got delayed and I think was actually canceled during the transition. But it kind of accelerated a scramble for a Red Sea port project. So then we saw the Qataris sign a $4 billion deal to take over the national port of Port Sudan, and that too fell through because of protests. And, you know, this was also the period that gold replaced oil as one of Africa's biggest producers of gold. By 2022, I think they were the 12th largest producer of gold in the world. And so on the one hand, you have the RSF or the Janjaweed militia, who were largely responsible for the genocidal violence in Darfur, and who I'll talk about a little bit later, who were created by the Bashir regime as part of a coup-proofing strategy against the army, who control much of the livestock and gold trade in the country. And then on the other hand, you have the army, which was acquiring larger and larger sections or segments of the economy, over 200 companies in rubber, cement, wheat, real estate, construction, etc. And so then in 2011, 2013, and 2016, we saw protests not only in Khartoum, but also in other places, mostly again triggered by IMF recommended austerity measures, but also state violence and repression, mass unemployment, economic crisis. We saw those protests get brutally squashed at the beginning of the kind of Arab Spring, if you will. But it's during that period that neighborhood resistance committees kind of emerged as a key organizing body. And they are these like neighborhood consensus-based collectives, which have been kind of operating in the absence of a civilian state for the last decade. They've mobilized mostly against kind of around anti-regime protests, but they've also kind of organized around access to water and other basic services in neighborhoods, kind of sliding scale supermarkets or like food markets, flood relief efforts, COVID prevention, playground cleanups, school and mosque repairs. They've organized against government land grabs, etc. So yeah, so I would say that kind of brings us up to the transitional period. And I
Mhm.
know that was kind of a handful, but I just wanted to kind of lay that out.
Oh, no, thank you for that. I mean, we got to lay a foundation so people who are not familiar with this history, get some grasp of it, So thank you for that. I learned a few things there that I want to come back and ask some questions on. But um, so, bringing us up more to speed. So, the Bashir finally gets ousted in 2019, 2018, 2019. And the transitional government comes in. And so who were the international actors, that were backing it? I think that's one of the fundamental questions that was never clear to me, even during that time, just trying to understand, like, you know, um, so much of at least some of like the parts of the infrastructure, at least to the north, are highly dependent upon Egypt, and uh, where Egypt's military kind of, regime is at has always been a bit, kind of questionable. Their economy has been teetering, but we know that they have some long-term kind of interest there. And it just wasn't clear, particularly kind of after, quote unquote, the Arab Spring, like to what degree was this transitional government and what was a successful revolution where so many others had actually failed. Um, like, were they going to like kind of gang up and try to strangle the transition government? Was kind of what my fear was as a kind of outside observer. But just, because of the coverage and I think the nature of the period, it was very hard to kind of figure out, well, who's doing what on the field. And, Trump was in office at that time. So he wasn't giving any, special focus or attention to most things, like kind of on the continent. Most of his focus was, really around Saudi Arabia and trying to construct a whole new deal between them and Israel, which set the stage for where we at now. But it just wasn't clear. So if you can lay some of that out, in this ring, like, who were the supporters of the transitional government and who were the opponents, and
Right.
why did it kind of fall into this the mix. Muzan talked about, that it wind up kind of adopting a bunch of neoliberal policies, itself, and started to lose the level of popular support. But who was pushing that? Was that strictly internal, or was that being reinforced and pushed by external players?
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I'm gonna try to lay that out. It's an excellent question, and I'm sure Muzan did I haven't seen that interview yet, but she does a really excellent job, usually, of kind of laying all of that out as well. And I think one of the things to remember is that while Bashir was ousted, right, by the popular revolution, I mean, he was removed by the military.
Mm-hmm.
Very shortly after, the Transitional Military Council formed and took over power, before the transitional government was created, and they then, after the transitional government was created in August of 2019, formed one faction of the transitional government, but power was always tilted in their favor. And that Transitional Military Council was still consisted still of people from Bashir's inner circles, even if they might ideologically be a little bit, different or whatever. They were still part of the same, I don't know, group of like criminals, if you will, that sort of took over power, right? Yeah, so I'm just gonna I'll lay out some of it, and then you can always stop me if there are things that you want me to clarify. So yeah, so in December of 2018, as I'm sure Muzan explained, there was a powerful popular revolution. We saw kind of urban, like rural and urban demands for land reform and economic justice at the center kind of converge with these decade-old struggles for justice and self-determination. Uh, um, Kind of, yeah, they kind of converged to this. And then in April, and they sort of started in the peripheries, actually, in places like Atbara, which is known for its railroad worker organizing and history of resistance to colonial and post-colonial regimes, Damazin, Mairnu, right, before converging and centralizing to some degree in a sit-in in front of the military headquarters in the capital, Khartoum. And I mention this just because it makes it clear that this revolution was a bit different from previous ones that have overthrown military regimes, and that it was, yeah, it was less middle class, less urban, kind of elite driven, right? That we did see a convergence that we had never seen before on some level. So then in April, al-Bashir is ousted, but the sit-in remains in place because people's demands kind of exceeded calls for regime change, and because, as I mentioned, military elites from within his inner circles had kind of reclaimed power. And the backbone of the revolution, as I mentioned before, I would say were these resistance committees, of which there are now close to 8,000 across the country, but also independent farmer and labor unions, professional associations, feminist organizations like youth and student formations, the kind of grassroots civil society that has, for the most part, resisted NGOization and kind of formal opposition party politics. And I remember very clearly in February of 2019, so this is before al-Bashir was ousted, there was a US delegation that arrived in Khartoum to discuss investment opportunities in infrastructure and mining as the regime was, with the regime, right? As the regime was killing protesters on the street. Embassy officials were like taking photo ops with protesters at the sit-in while exploring signing these deals with the military elites who were brutalizing them. And so I think this is what happens often in transitional periods, right? Is that it becomes a kind of scramble, especially in the case of Sudan, because there was the potential for these kind of Clinton era sanctions to be lifted, and now the US wanted to kind of swoop in, right? And because of these sanctions, there's been less US corporate intervention in Sudan. There was plenty, for example, in South Sudan after independence, but they were kind of waiting to pounce, it feels a little bit. And they were like examples of the US coercing the regime into signing a deal or paying a fee to the families of the 9/11 attacks in return for sanctions being removed, with the end goal being to open Sudan up to direct like US investment. I think there has always been like indirect investment, US investment through allies, etc. But they're of course kind of harder to lay out. So then in June of 2019, after a kind of state-led, really RSF orchestrated massacre broke up the sit-in, we saw the resistance committees and the kind of more radical elements of the revolution really get sidelined during the formation of a transitional government in favor of civilian elites, right, that were kind of led by the Sudanese Professionals Association, many from the diaspora, who attempted to open Sudan up after decades of isolation to kind of international donor funding. And those civilian elites, I think, turned kind of outward during the transition, adopting neoliberal reforms rather than kind of staying focused on the demands that were emerging from the streets. And to me, that was in many ways the beginning of the counter-revolution, right? And an example of this is the Abraham Accord, which is a normalization with Israel agreement, which was signed by Sudan during the transition in exchange for being dropped from the US list of state sponsors of terrorism, and the promise for the US to clear over $1 billion in arrears from the World Bank as well, right? Amidst, I think, some opposition from the streets. And after the October 2021 military coup, we then saw the UN lead peace talks, right, that were kind of led by the US, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and the UK, the countries that are sort of, in some ways, wreaked the most havoc, legitimize and prop up the coup leaders, in this case, Burhan, head of the army, Hemeti, head of the RSF, who are both responsible for war crimes that span decades. And these negotiations really framed them as potential reformists, really ignoring the call of the resistance committees, which called for no negotiations, no legitimacy, and no partnership with the military. And I'm sure Muzan talked about this. And to me, this lack of accountability and sort of international diplomacy, right, as a tool of empire, kind of prioritizing stability over revolutionary demands, is partly what paved the way for this war. And so after the coup, the UAE, for example, signed a $6 billion deal to develop a port project and airport some 200 kilometers north of the national port of Port Sudan. And I think they chose that location because they learned from the kind of Qatari and Turkish experience and feared organized resistance. So they chose this kind of relatively rural coastal area where there's a small community of fisher folk. Those people still organized and came out in protest, and the deal was ultimately upended. But again, I think it's, though there were, like, I'm sure, kickback payments associated with all these deals that ended up increasing the cash flow to ruling military elites. And under US sanctions, there's also a kind of Islamic banking system that was really backed by Gulf states that sort of has been enabling kind of these cash flows to military elites, right? So yeah, I think that brings us up to the war, I would say. So I don't know if you have any clarifying questions or anything.
John, but let's just, in the interest of time, get to the third set of questions about, where are we at now between the Army and the RSF, and who's really supporting them?
Yes.
I think that's one of the key questions. And one of the pieces I want us to, at some point, maybe come back to and maybe touch on today that I didn't, put in some of the prep questions. The activist, the organizer, I mean, is always kind of like, the international, like, what can we do? So that's how do we apply pressure on the UAE, the Saudis, all of these international players? But I think first that we need analysis of, who are the players and, where do they stand? Because they're some seem to be trying to play both sides of the coin, but others seem to be very committed to one side or another, and that's just kind of perpetuating, this war going on. To me, it seems like it's not clear how this is going to be resolved. There's no clear end in sight. So if you can kind of lay out to us like that field, so we know, I think that kind of lays the ground for what folks on the international level may be able to do and help, intervene in some concrete ways.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think one thing that's clear, and I think Ismail kind of laid this out really well as well, is that US policy towards Sudan has always been confusing and not particularly consistent. And some of it, I think, is about like their own relationship to the continent, and seeing sort of most, I feel like, US sort of policy towards the continent gets funneled through this lens of either kind of the war on terror or countering Russian, well, Chinese really, and then Russian now influence on the continent, right? And so we see some of that play itself out, but um, like yeah. So anyway, I'll get into it now. So basically, on April 15th, I mean, I was there when the war broke out. The kind of coup regime imploded and split, with each faction, the RSF and the army, kind of vying for economic and political control of the country. People say that the trigger was this kind of disagreement over security sector reform, but of course, the roots of this, as we all know, are a lot kind of more structural and historical. And so, yeah, I would say on the one hand, we have the rapid support forces, who control some of the livestock and the illicit gold trade in the country, which gets funneled to the gold markets of the UAE and then sold to Russia and other countries. In 2022, the Darfur Bar Association documented the presence of Wagner mercenaries and their connections to the RSF in relation to gold mining. And, as I mentioned before, this is at the time when oil kind of started to replace, gold started to replace gold. I mean, oil started to replace gold, right? And the UAE became, during that period, Sudan's kind of main trading partner. And it's now providing critical military support to the RSF through Chad, through the Central African Republic, and through Libya's Haftar, like under the cover of humanitarian forms of support. And on the other hand, we have the Sudanese armed forces and its allied Islamists led by General Burhan, who, as I mentioned earlier, control large sectors of Sudan's economy, which were in turn backed by Gulf financing and have close ties to Egypt's Sisi. Burhan, I think, went to military college with Sisi, so they have a kind of personal relationship. Recent reports suggest that the Ukraine has been supporting the army in order to kind of interrupt the ways Russia is benefiting from Sudan's gold. Iran has also recently been supplying Sudan's army with precision drones, presumably to counter Emirati power and access to the Red Sea. I think you've discussed this already, but the RSF were legitimized by something called the Khartoum process in 2014, a process through which the European Union is kind of attempting to externalize its border to the region between Sudan and Libya. And at the time, they paid the regime 200 million to kind of militarize it and to use the RSF to stem the migration of East Africans into Europe. Both the RSF and the army have sent troops to fight in Yemen on the Saudi coalition's behalf. The RSF was paid to fight in Libya alongside Haftar as well. And so all of this also expanded their kind of transnational networks, right? And I would also say there are some, as I mentioned earlier, mining, particularly like PR companies, North American PR companies that are implicated. But in some ways, I think to kind of lay out the political economy of Sudan's war requires also decentering the US, not necessarily US empire, but it's really the Gulf states, I would say, and the kind of regional countries that are the bigger players here. Yeah, and so, yeah, and I guess I think I talked a little bit about the kind of neoliberal structuring of the agricultural economy that I think is important to keep in mind. I wanted to mention something that I haven't actually ever talked about before, but I think is important, which is, I remember in February of 2023, David Beasley, who's a former South Carolina Republican governor, who at the time was the head of the World Food Program, he posted a video on Twitter or X, whatever it's called, and he was standing in the middle of a wheat field in Sudan, essentially inviting US private agribusiness investors to come and invest in Sudan. So this is just a couple of months before the war broke out. And he said, I'm standing in the middle of a wheat field in Sudan. This is a country that has 210 million acres of arable land, and only 25% of it is being used. And I can assure you, we're going to have a food availability problem. He said, Ukraine, the breadbasket of the world, feeding over 400 million people, shut down. But if we can get private investors in here, into Sudan, and grow the food we need, we can not only feed Sudan, but actually feed the whole world, right? So then I did a bit of digging on him. And I also tweeted at him or whatever, and found that just as the Biden administration was cutting COVID-related food stamps, he was supporting legislation for US agribusiness firms to use the World Food Program to dump subsidized American corn, wheat, etc., onto Horn of Africa markets to kind of have that NAFTA effect of decimating local production, and to then swoop in and kind of create markets for US agribusiness, right? And to start investing through land grabs. because we all know that this arable land that he's talking about, right? Not only is it being used for herding, but they're not going to be leasing land that isn't being used for farming. They're going to be leasing land that is by the Nile or over an underground aquifer. So they're going to be grabbing land from small farmers, land that has already been readied for planting. And so, I mean, I think that's also an important thing. I actually was writing an article about it on April 14th. Like I was in Sudan writing this, and I wanted to kind of tie the politics of hunger in the US to the politics of hunger in Sudan through organizations like the World Food Program, which are now also, I think it's led by Cindy McCain now. But then the war broke out, and now we're like
Daughter of McCain, oh, Senator McCain, or a
isn't that
relative
his
to
wife? No,
married.
Cindy McCain is not. I think she's his wife because she looks a little older.
Maybe I just didn't think that she was in the field. But anyway, we can look that up. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, right now we need food to come in. There's a famine happening. There's a Kligendale report that said that 2.5 million Sudanese could potentially die if things on the ground don't change because both parties are obstructing food aid, right? And so, yeah, so it wouldn't be appropriate to kind of publish that right now, but I did want to mention that because I think that's important. I also want to mention briefly Egypt's role. They've been supplying the army with weapons. And, they've also, by the way, accepted, and we should talk about immigration if we have time, but they've accepted 200 million from the EU to start deporting Sudanese refugees. And their interests are related to the kind of spillover effect of the war, particularly kind of refugees, but also the GERD, the Grand, what is it called? The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, right? And they're wanting Sudan to side with them against the Ethiopians, right? Because the battle there is around like how much it gets filled to and how that then impacts Egyptian access to the Nile waters and so forth. So I'm just going to end with this. Right now, right, and I'm sure you probably talked about this, but Sudan's civilian population of 45 million is caught in the middle of this war. 25 million Sudanese are now in dire need of food aid in a country that could easily feed itself and the region. 19 million children are out of school. The healthcare system has largely collapsed. So I've had some of my own relatives have died of bullets, but then others have died because they get to the hospital and there's no healthcare, right? Or it's too late. They don't have medications, etc. Over 10 million people have been displaced by this war, making Sudan the largest internal displacement crisis in the world. And yet we have not seen any country issue free special visas for Sudanese refugees. The death toll was actually recently, I read in the Washington Post, the US estimates the death toll to be around 150,000, but it's very difficult to track and count. And that's like almost, 10 times what it was originally like recently reported at. As only 20% of the estimated 4 billion needed to launch an adequate response effort has been received by the international community. The RSF is continuing to gain ground. They're occupying and looting people's homes, systematically using rape as a weapon of war, forcibly starving people, using civilians as human shields. In Darfur and the Nuba Mountains, they've kind of reactivated and intensified ethnic cleansing campaigns against non-Arab communities that long predate this war. And then the army, on the other hand, has failed to evacuate or protect people. They've bombed civilian areas, including hospitals and homes, killing and injuring civilians, and both parties, as I mentioned, have obstructed the entry of international aid. And so I have to end by saying in the midst of all this, there are these emergency response rooms that have emerged across the country during the war, modeled after resistance committees and led by many of its members. And in the face of a largely absent international aid community, in part because of obstruction, but also other dynamics, and of course a civilian state, they're organizing communal kitchens, they're coordinating evacuations and protection activities, they're setting up ad hoc emergency clinics and rape crisis centers, they're converting defunct schools into shelters, they're retrieving and burying dead bodies and organizing learning activities for children. They have kind of urban gardening projects. And these are volunteers, like in Sudan, in Khartoum alone, I think there's over 1,400 volunteers who were operating 69 emergency response rooms. Some of them have shut down. Across Darfur, there are about 89 emergency response rooms. And we at the Sudan Solidarity Collective have been supporting them. We've raised about $250,000 for them, and it's gone mostly to communal kitchens. but we've kind of told them they can use it more or less how they want. And part of the reason I mentioned this is because to me, you know, their kind of revolutionary energy is being diverted, and I'm sure Muzan talked about this, you know, into sort of putting out fires, right? And emergency relief. But at their core, they're still emerging out of these revolutionary groups that have developed charters and even have a political vision for how to get out of this war that I think is important to kind of highlight and support. Like I get often asked, like, how are we going to end this war? And I tell people, don't ask me that. You got to ask the people on the ground, the volunteers, the people who are members of resistance committees who continue to put out, who are continuing to organize on the ground, who continue to put out analysis, and who get completely sidelined in any negotiations that are happening at the high level, right? So yeah, I just wanted to kind of end with that. Yeah.
Well, thank you for all of that. You know, a lot to chew on. You know, I definitely want our audience to really, you know, look into the emergency response work and figure out ways in which, you know, people can donate it and support it. So definitely we'll be asking you for information on that, Nasreen, so we can get out there, kind of attach it with this video to kind of help that effort. But before opening it up, I would like you to touch on some of the ecological factors that you were mentioning and how that is kind of played out and exacerbated a number of different things. And why, you know, in my read on it, you can correct me if I'm wrong, you know, the growing seasons in Sudan have not necessarily shifted as bad as they have like up north in Egypt. And it's one thing I read maybe 2 years ago was just talking about part of the reason why was some of the more traditional, you know, practices being maintained, even despite all of the land grabbing activities. Um, so I'm wondering if is that like your analysis, given like the scope that you presented of how much the UAE and folks owned, you know, that was greater than what I had kind of had imagined. I knew about the enclosures and some of the things that's going on, you know, with the pastoralists, but I mean, that's a tremendous amount of land. And is that still like owned, or in the context of the wars that all kind of loosened up, you know, and what are the impacts there relative to that, you know, and I'm putting this question, I want us to deal with this question. Like I just saw a day or two ago, you know, that was it June was the hottest month ever recorded, you know, on the planet Earth. So, you know, things are not looking good relative to climate change and what is not being done by all the nation states of the world to kind of address this. This is definitely kind of a runaway train right now. And so really having to try to figure out what can we do on the grassroots level, you know, the community levels to kind of win and tilt the balance in this particular way. So if you could speak to some of that, just as to where, you know, things have been playing out in Sudan, that I think that would clarify a number of different things as well.
Yeah, so actually, just to clarify, so you're saying that in some ways the ecological damage in Egypt has been greater. Is that what you're saying?
That's what some of this, you know, I take it with a grain of salt. Let me be more clear. I take it with a grain of salt. It was a comparative piece that I read while I was in Kenya
Okay.
about like 2 years ago. Um, and it was a piece that somebody basically kind of handed to me about climate change in East and North Africa. And
Okay.
one of the things I just remember sticking out where they were just the article was really trying to promote agroecology in a number of fundamental ways.
Okay.
Um, and it was saying that because some traditional methods have been retained in the Sudan,
I
that you
see.
could look at what was going on in Egypt with the major hydroelectric dams, the
I see.
level of displacement that's taking place there, that Sudan was faring better than Egypt was. Now,
Hmm.
how true that was, I have no clue, you know, from no independent analysis. But it was one of the things that just like what I do know, I'm like, I don't know how would that be maintained or even assessed in the context of, by that time, when I had read this, the counter revolution was already in place.
Mm,
Uh, and I would think some of the things around how, the split between the South Sudan and the Sudan and the nature of the war, I'm like, it would be kind of hard to assess a number of those different things. So is this just somebody making an argument, right,
mm.
to kind of like prove a particular case and then promote a particular set of practices? And let me just say for the record, the Cooperation Jackson practices agroecology. We're big promoters of it, and continually trying to learn from comrades in La Via Campesina, et cetera. But I am, was aware, like, this may be promoting something rather than having enough concrete information to make the case that they're trying to make.
I see. Yeah, I mean, I think, and this is partly why we um, interviewed folks on the ground for this like series for Hammer and Hope, right? Where for the first iteration we interviewed a good friend of mine who's a farmer and union organizer, and he's also the representative of the Via Campesina for like the region, one of the representatives. And so, I mean, I think there is potentially some truth to this in the sense that the Saudis and Emiratis and some of the other states, there are other Arab countries that have grabbed land. I focus mostly on the Jazeera, the central kind of, yeah, central Sudan. The Jazeera scheme is kind of nestled between the White and the Blue Nile. So it's kind of like the Mississippi Delta a little bit. It's a very fertile area. In fact, there's some parallels, I think, in terms of like what is grown and the kind of just the soil and so forth. But I would say the Bashir regime really tried to destroy the scheme, but didn't succeed because of the organizing. And so that is part of the story, is that there has been a lot of resistance. That's partly what I study. The areas where they've managed to grab land, and some of it for domestic investors, some of it for foreign investors. And I would say the domestic investors are also like wreaking havoc on the environment, right? It's not only the foreign ones. That those lands were grabbed in areas where there was a different kind of regime in terms of property regime, right? And so they're mostly communal lands that were used for rain-fed farming. And that's usually subsistence farming. And so, but those tend to be the less desirable pieces of land depending on how far away they are from the Nile. So I don't know if that's answering your question, but I'm sure I mean, Sudan's a huge country. There are probably areas where there isn't much investment, where people are continuing to farm as they have for decades, right? And where maybe there isn't the same kind of ecological harm. But from my experience, and I lived in the Jazeera for like 15 months doing research, and I harvested with people and so forth, I saw with my own eyes the kind of ecological damage that was being wrought by the agribusiness practices that were being used, right? The chemical fertilizers, the pesticides, the aggressive pumping of sort of underground water resources. And we saw it even in people's health. Like, I would talk to local doctors and they told me that there are these rare forms of cancer and respiratory diseases that had skyrocketed out of nowhere. And a lot of it had to do with the use of particular chemicals that you might not be able to use elsewhere, but in the context of Sudan, there was nobody
Mm-hmm.
holding it accountable, right? And so, for example, I remember there was a Saudi farm that was established further north from where I was that pumped the underground water resource so aggressively that they depleted that resource within the span of 3 years,
Wow.
right? And so that is something that I'm very worried about, is that people have been saying, oh, these leases are for 25 to 99 years. That's a very long time. But really, they don't care so much how long these leases go for. They're going to use them max 5, 10, maybe 15 years, and then they're going to have depleted the land and move on to the next project, right? In their view, there's like an endless amount of land available to them that they can just grab. And I think that is also very dangerous, both in the ways that it's undermining people's livelihoods and in the kind of damage it's causing the environment. And people that I spoke to, the herders that that I interviewed for my dissertation, for example, said that they've seen with their own eyes the damage that has been wrought. Of course, we're also talking about climate change more broadly, but that they themselves are worried about, like, 7 generations from now, will it even be possible to herd in this area, right?
Mm.
Because of the kind of havoc that's being wrought, and of course because of climate change more broadly, and and then you also saw flooding. Like, I've seen flooding over the last decade or so get more and more intense, and this is actually where um, some of the neighborhood resistance committees and the kind of mutual aid work emerged from, was flood relief, because the state has just kind of neglected people. And so that too obviously impacts farming, right? So I think there's a kind of convergence of both these, like, privatization policies, land grabs, the shift in the kind of crops that are being grown. So, for example, the Emirati farm that I study is growing a very water intensive alfalfa crop that is from the Dominican Republic, that is quite, like, harmful to the environment. Apparently, it's like it's actually a colonial crop, from what I understand. And so, it's also the types of crops that are being grown, the fact that they don't allow land to lay fallow, right? That they just kind of continue exploiting, extracting, etc. So there are these traditional farming practices that have historically preserved the soil and the water, etc., that are being, set aside now. And also that farming is just no longer viable because of the way that markets have been taken over. And so people are moving out of farming into other sectors like construction and so forth, or the security state. The RSF and the army are now the largest employers. And so that's also dangerous, right? Is that we just don't have, I mean, we all know that small farmers and sort of agroecologists are the ones who treat the earth best. And the more people exit, the worse that is for all of us, right? Yeah.
Hmm. Um, well, thank you for that. That raises some more questions for me. But I want to open it up now. We're basically at the four. I'm not going to just flood the Nesreen with questions, so I'm going to open it up to those who are here. If you have any questions, you can definitely put them in the chat. But I guess one particular uh, uh, piece to maybe reference, to the international kind of like players, um, who is pushing, if at all, who is pushing for peace right now? Um, and I'm asking in the with the backdrop of what's going on in Palestine, where there've been some pretty significant efforts, but they basically come to naught, but primarily because of the United States is just not going to bend on putting any pressure on Israel. But in the meantime, there's been a tremendous amount of actual alignment amongst most of the nation states in the world in kind of pushing for peace in Palestine. Haven't seen that level of either interest or regard as it relates to Sudan.
Yeah.
So who is are there any African states that are kind of leading the charge, trying to do
Hmm.
anything in this regard?
Yeah. I mean, to be completely honest, when the war first started, I was following closely what was happening with the negotiations. I was sort of hopeful that there would be some type of ceasefire, and then I quickly realized at the time there were Jeddah talks that were led by the U.S. and Saudi Arabia in Jeddah, and it was quite clear from there that, I mean, there wasn't, like, a permanent ceasefire wasn't even on the table, and in many ways those initial talks kind of uh, green lighted the war, in my view. Like, they just continued legitimizing the people that started the war, and also, like, Jeddah not the right place for peace talks, given what I've told you about the
Right.
role of the Gulf in all of this, right? So, I mean, they recently, that same group of people, I mean, really led by the US now, but have announced that they're going to start peace talks in Switzerland, led by the US and Saudi Arabia, and they're going to have, I think, the UN, the African Union, and I think the Emirates as observers. Um, there've been, I feel like, a gazillion peace tracks. It's so many that it's hard to keep track of. Cairo has hosted some talks. The African Union, IGAD, have hosted talks, and none of them have centered like the resistance committees, for example, that are the ones really representing the people's view. And meanwhile, the situation on the ground has gotten more complex as communities also, I think Ismail talked about this, like have gotten militarized, right? Have sort of armed themselves to protect themselves, which is also understandable, but it also, of course, complicates things, right? Like how do you then demilitarize after kind of,
Absolutely.
long period? Yeah. And so, and humanitarian aid continues to be obstructed. There isn't enough pressure. I mean, there isn't enough attention, period, right? When do you ever see Sudan in the headlines? And even when it is in the headlines, it's usually about the famine in a very decontextualized, dehistoricized way. Like the New York Times ran a story that in many ways was just like, what was the point of that? You know what I mean? Without kind of calling out the UAE, that is, if they were to stop arming the RSF, the war tomorrow, for example, the war would look different on the ground. I think they're one of the main players here that have never been held to account, right? And I think the diaspora is rightfully calling for a boycott. But of course, it's an authoritarian regime. How it responds to that depends also on whether it's only the Sudanese diaspora or a much kind of broader swath of people, which we haven't been able to mobilize in the same way that the kind of free like movement for free Palestine has. And some of that is on us, and some of it has to do with anti-black racism and the kind of complete media blackout around Sudan. And so for me, like I put my faith still in the resistance committees, but even the volunteers that I'm talking about, the emergency response room folks, they're being targeted every day. A lot of them, like there was a siege on Al Fashir, or continues to be really, and some of the volunteers that we've been in communication with, or at least like we've supported, right, have gotten killed in that. And so, we've had to evacuate emergency response room folks and help with that. So they're in harm's way as well, and they're trying to get to safety in some cases. So I don't know. I mean, I'm quite depressed about the situation. At the same time, I know that the only solution is going to come from Sudan and not from us in the diaspora, even. I think we've made that mistake many times before, where the diaspora has taken on a bigger role than it should. Certainly during the transition, that was the case. And yeah, I think, I mean, there needs to be a kind of more coordinated effort. These tracks need to all come together in terms of the negotiations. They need to center civilians and not civilian elites that don't have the interests of the Sudanese people at heart, which is currently what's happening. But like, like the kind of backbone of the revolution, at least representatives of them. And they need to call out the external, like really what we need. This is how I feel. And this is my own, people might disagree with me on this, but I feel like Sudan needs a hands-off approach for the most part, right? We've had plenty of negative intervention in Sudan. And just like Haiti, I would like to see, especially after the war ends, a kind of hands-off Sudan, you know? There have been plenty of, negative forms of intervention. And then the more kind of so-called positive forms have really just legitimized the coup leaders, and are, I think, going to produce at this stage at least, and this is what we talked about in the article, a kind of peace that restores governance but not justice, and justice and accountability is incredibly important. um, so that's that. On the other hand, the revolution was incredible and is incredible. In some ways I think it continues. And so who knows what is going to happen in the future. I don't know, I'm just, yeah, feel like I'm ending on a confusing note, but
No, look, I don't know about confused. I wouldn't say that. This is a time where everywhere we look, there's so many unsettled questions.
mhm,
And, there's part of it. This is just me editorializing now, so y'all forgive me. But I think there's a way in which, there's just tried and true around organizing, the actual, day-to-day grind of organizing and building relationships, building community, building each other's capacities, and building clarity about, where we want to go and how we want to get there over a period of time that we all have to do.
mhm,
Because, just this, our forces are so weak wherever you look. I think right now on the planet, our forces are so weak, and, the right and reactionary forces just have so much. I wouldn't say momentum is the right word, and not that they don't have momentum, but we always have to remember they're countenanced and supported by, capital in so many different
Right.
ways.
Yeah.
So they buy audiences, they buy interests, they buy people.
Hmm.
But it's not like it's deep, in many respects. Now, some of the reactionary response of, communities that have been kind of displaced or facing labor replacement, or particularly in like the U.S. or Europe, that's eliciting kind of a racist response. I think some of that's real, and the fascists are feeding off that, but they don't have a solution. It's
Mm.
not like the fascists have a solution that's actually going to solve the problem of the people that they're, whose resentment and anger that they're kind of feeding off of right now. But yeah, this one I would just say, like the Haiti, the Sudan, Palestine to me are, like the way out is just not really clear, and
Hmm.
they all pose so many kind of like different challenges. But the one in the Sudan, that this one is steering me in a particular way that, like, just my old left internationalist hat doesn't have some answers, because it's like, okay, clearly, for the audience and for the record, what I'm speaking to, clearly, um, the United States, U.S. imperialism has definitely kind of tried to hunker down in Kenya, you know, uh, per se, right? There's the different connections. Clearly, they come with Obama and some of the things that they tried to lead out, while he was in office. That
Hmm.
really, I think Ruto is bearing the fruit of, and that the Biden administration was trying to continue.
Hmm.
And the peace with Kenya, in many respects, was a reward for jobs that they did in Somalia, some
Hmm.
things that they did in a couple of different places. And then for them to try to roll out, they're going to give them that, more, the favored nation status, and
Yeah.
the whole piece around, being close to like a non-NATO, high level kind of ally, which is blowing up in their face right
Hmm.
now, presently, thankfully.
Yeah.
But the piece that I don't, it's like clearly, um, they need that port access. They need the geopolitical access around being around, the Horn, particularly with the kind of the loss that them and the Saudis suffered,
Hmm.
in Yemen, because they were not totally able to defeat Ansar Allah.
Hmm.
Still kind of an unsettled state kind of dynamic there. But the Ansar Allah, also known as the Houthis for the audience, they're still kicking up dust and fighting back, as part of the overall axis of resistance, in some many fundamental ways, which is making, the Red Sea, I wouldn't say it's unnavigable, but definitely, they're extracting some costs for capital to kind of move goods, through there in
Yeah.
a significant way. And so, Kenya being, looking like it was the most stable area in port, they clearly were trying to reshift there, but also trying to counter China. And with South Sudan in particular, it seemed like it was making more moves to not totally be in kind of the Chinese camp, but definitely, like, if y'all want to come in and exploit the oil, there's clearly a faction in the South Sudanese government, despite their conflicts, which is favorable to that, right, as a source. And it would just seem to me that the U.S. wanting to counter the Chinese having any more access to resources would then, put some vested interest and energy into kind of stabilizing the Sudan. But I don't like, there doesn't seem to be an effort on their part. So it's kind of like, even on the level of U.S. imperialism, like, who's driving the ship right now? It's not clear.
Yeah. I
Um,
mean, I think they're starting to realize that there's the danger of a spillover effect of this war, right? And so I have seen in the last couple of months, um, there are more articles, for example, in the mainstream media calling the RSF and the sort of UAE connection out. Um, when in the beginning I felt like the UAE was kind of waiting to see like who was going to get the upper hand and who are they going to back, but now it seems like they're more, the US is a little bit more aligned with the army. And it's always been stability over like popular democracy, right? And so, I think I mean, I'm waiting to see what's going to happen in Switzerland. I don't have high hopes. I don't think we can really expect positive intervention from any of these kind of states or kind of multilateral institutions given the history. But at the same time, I mean, I think about like I remember when we left Khartoum and we were walking through this like bus area and it was littered with missiles. Um, and the parts were coming from all different parts. I looked them up after because I took a picture, which is not, you're not really supposed to do that. You can get, the RSF was all over the place. So, and I then looked it up when I got back to Canada and realized like each of these, and there were so many of them, were worth at least $500. And then you look up the other kind of, weaponry and military equipment that's being used, and you just realize like millions, billions of dollars being
Right.
used to destroy, right? And I remember one of the things that we weren't able to publish in the Hammer and Hope article, and I just want to quote this that Abdul Rauf told us. He said, since the war started, 5,000 light factories, 6 to 8,000 blacksmith and carpentry workshops. I think he said, I think something like 15,000 buses, 14 central markets, and 22,000 shops have been destroyed or looted. And so to think about also the kind of, not to mention all the other kind of, destruction that's been caused, but to think about how much money has been spent and how much has been destroyed, and what it will take to kind of rebuild a country that was already in deep economic crisis, right? It's pretty depressing, right? Beyond the kind of human suffering and deaths that has been caused and the genocidal violence that has intensified and so forth. It's like, in the end, for me, most of my family remains in Sudan. Most of my family was struggling before the war, and I'm actually the only wage earner in the extended family on my mother's side. So it wouldn't make sense for them to leave, right? They wouldn't be able to afford it. It's very expensive to leave. And I wanted to mention this. The border regimes that we're seeing across the 7 borders and beyond that have been extremely violent towards Sudanese people, right? I think there's an informal ban on Sudanese people applying for visas across the West. It's costing, thousands of dollars to get smuggled into Egypt, and now Egypt is deporting people. The UK was starting to deport people under that Rwanda deal that they signed with Kagame, and the first person apparently to get deported was Sudanese, right? So we're also seeing the way that Sudanese refugees, despite the fact that it's the largest internal displacement crisis in the world, have been completely abandoned. They're being denied the right to seek asylum, right? And so I don't know, it's just like, I think it's a disaster in the making, and yet Tigray happened and the world kind of looked the other way. So I also feel like I don't know, I'm in a moment right now where, given the history of Sudan, we know that these wars have taken decades sometimes to resolve themselves. I just don't know like what to do, we're really, I think, as a diaspora and as people who have loved ones on the ground, feeling the weight of the reality that many, many more people are going to die if things don't change on the ground, of hunger. And that's really depressing. Yeah.
Well, I'm hoping it's part of one of the reasons why I wanted to do this series is just try to educate more people, period. In the U.S. But our international practice is shit, and we have to figure out what we can do. And there's so much that a grounded political force in the U.S. could do, to disrupt many of the operations, say like the UAE or Saudi Arabia, but having both the knowledge and the political clarity and enough, organizing capacity to kind of take these on and to really, be grounded in anti-imperialist, politic. Um, that's a piece that has to be built kind of step by step,
Mhm.
because I could just think of many things and many, kind of targets around the UAE, throughout the United States, just vested interest, just protests, basic protest stuff, could both ways, awareness and, make a certain degree of business a little bit more costly, a little bit more tricky for them, at least in regards to kind of like the U.S. investments and the interests that they want to kind of uphold, and how they want to do so many different things in secret, right? And us just exposing that, I'm not saying ultimately would change all of the dynamics, but it would at least enforce a different, a cost of doing business, put it that way,
Yeah.
that I think that we can do, but there's just so many blind spots and for
Yeah.
lack of knowledge in the U.S. that we have to overcome, I think, to do that, in some fundamental ways. And for me, Nisri, I'm just, it's one of these. Let me say this, um, the most frustrating part about this period, for me, as a new African, is just seeing in so many ways how the U.S. empire is so overextended and so, confused and weak in so many ways that, if we had something, uh, there's so many different kind of wedges and opportunities that we could exploit. So not really having a real left party and apparatus right now, I'm really just kicking myself of like, we got to get our act together,
Yeah.
because this is a period where there's profound opportunities at play, because to the extent that we are kind of confused, they are also confused,
Mhm.
very confused and not quite sure, where they're going, which is why, I'm not for the Democrats or the Republicans, but you can see that there are some real stakes relative to which way the U.S. empire is going to go,
Mhm.
in this election. Then I think that we could intervene on in so many fundamental ways, if we had a little bit something more organized. And so there's a major period. So I'm frustrated by the lack of organization, but I'm always encouraged looking at the situation and seeing that there's this tremendous amount of opening and opportunity in the midst of these crises, that could produce something different, profoundly different.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean I agree, and I feel kind of bad that I just went down that kind of depressing um path or
No,
whatever. But I mean I do. I mean for one, I feel like the movement, the sort of solidarity movement for Palestine has opened up. I think contrary to it overshadowing, I think it's actually opened up um, kind of it's created openings for people to want to know more about Sudan and the Congo and Haiti, and Tigray to a degree as well. And part of what I think our role in the diaspora is to kind of fill that role with uh, analysis and information, political education, right? That is really drawing on the very vibrant revolutionary base that exists and existed right before this war, that's sort of coming out of that, right? I think that's very important, that it not be sort of analysis produced elsewhere but coming really from the ground, which is partly why we um, are writing pieces like this, and it's also why we as a Sudan Solidarity Collective are supporting the ERRs. It's not because we believe in charity work, it's because we want to continue building the capacity of people, right, that are revolutionaries. And also, I think there's like one of the things that we've started doing as a collective is having conversations with Friends of the Congo and people who are kind of, working on Congo, for example, to see is there a potential for us to collaborate on targeting some of the companies that are wreaking havoc in both places, in all three places potentially. And there is some overlap, right? We're also in conversation now with the Palestinian youth movement around similar things. And so for me, that is the key, is to build coalitions and to broaden our bases. I am convinced that in the case of Sudan, if the general public around the world were more aware, if there were more willingness to kind of stand in solidarity and to really heed the call of the people on the ground, that things would shift. I think part of it is that, you know, we organize our Sudan protests and it's only us and the aunties and uncles that show up. You know what I mean? And that's on us partly, but it's also on everybody else, you know? It's like you can take the responsibility to educate yourself. I think the diaspora has provided opportunities for education. Yeah, it's like a two-way street. But I have a lot of hope in that. I think it's only through that kind of coalition building and movement building that we will get somewhere. I know, for example, I speak to Latin American comrades and they're super interested in knowing how they can support Sudan. And I think that to me is in some ways, certainly for the revolutionaries on the ground, that's a lot more valuable, right? Is to get support from other folks in the global South that are also have a vested interest in standing in solidarity with the kind of the people's choice and the people's demands, right? Rather than the elite's demands and the elite's war. So yeah, I mean, so I say all that to say that there have been many moments of hope in our organizing so far. We're very small as a collective, but we've also built a lot of, I think, good alliances and coalitions. And we certainly wouldn't have been able to, I mean, the money that we raised is all small donors, right? $10 monthly that are coming in. And it's mostly through political education and kind of coalition building and organizing that we've been able to do that. We have no institutional or grant support, right? So yeah, so I mean, I think if people want to get involved, I would say, you know, you can donate, you can educate yourself. I use Sudan Tribune and Radio Rabanga. Muzen and Neil's work is really, I think, has been really transformative for me. Atar Network, ATAR, has been publishing this really good magazine that comes out in Arabic and English that produces great analysis, as also the Ayin Network. You know, and I think just get linked up with the diaspora in your community and look out. We might be collaborating on a kind of potential boycott divestment with Congolese comrades. I think that could go somewhere. I mean, you know, we're still trying to kind of figure out how to do that. Everybody and their whatever is in the Congo, you know, so it's quite hard actually to figure out like how to approach that. But the UAE as one of the key players that is actually across the board involved on some level, right? Certainly in the region in relation to Palestine, but also Congo and Sudan. And I want to say this before we close. To me, I think one of the things that we have to start doing is to recognize the Gulf states, and in particular the Emirates, as doing its own form of empire making. I don't think we should always see them as doing the bidding for US empire. I think they're doing their own, like, you know, trifling kind of empire making. And I think part of that process of taking over port projects across the Horn of Africa is about controlling circuits of production, distribution, you know, networks of transportation, etc., as a way of sort of solidifying, consolidating their power across the region, across the Sahel and the Horn of Africa. And Sudan is kind of smack in the middle of all that. So I think it's important. People usually frame the land grabs as being about food security, but if it was about food security, then why are they predominantly producing animal feed? If it was only, I'm not saying it's not about food security, it is about food security, but it is also, in my view, part of a larger process of empire making. And when I say empire making, I mean, it is a new kind of imperial formation, but people generally perceive the Gulf as having kind of just, you know, turned from these like Bedouin states into oil producing wealthy states overnight. But, you know, they also had a slave trade and they had, you know, they accumulated wealth long before oil. And so I think that history is important in contextualizing this kind of empire making as well. So yeah, I just kind of wanted to mention that, to kind of see them also as doing their own empire making rather than only kind of, and they might be operating in the shadow of US empire and doing some of its bidding. I'm not saying they're not, but they're also doing their own things that we need to kind of be more strategic about disrupting. And certainly people on the ground in Sudan have been through their organizing. I mean, it's been incredible. Like before the war, I was so hopeful and so inspired by the organizing coming out of rural areas in particular. Even some of the urban folks, the revolutionaries in Khartoum, were sort of not taking it as seriously as they should, but it was incredibly powerful, and gave me a lot of hope. I mean, I was harvesting with women who had one of the best analyses of the IMF, you know, and of how it's like wreaking havoc, and sort of the privatization policies of the regime and how it's destroyed the agricultural sector. And many of them were not literate. So that in of itself, like the politicization that happened, the ways that people educated themselves during the revolution, will have a lasting impact on politics on the ground, you know. And to me, that's quite hopeful as well.
I was just about to ask some more questions, but I see we are now out of time.
Yeah.
I will say, one of the things I'm in agreement with your piece around like the UAE and the Gulf states,
Hmm.
and one of the pieces that I am planning to do maybe in the fall, is to just do a series that's about the Gulf states and Turkey, maybe to combine, maybe separate, because I think some way they're related but separate. Because I think there's a way in which, and rightfully so, for instance, particular focus on the U.S. Um, and its drive to get all of the Arab states in particular, to sign the Abraham Accords and to recognize Israel, right? And the real, in my view, the pitiful role that they played in just kind of watching this genocide and not being in real, any deep solidarity, with the Palestinians. That's my view. I'm not putting that on you, but but I think that you know, like someone is like, well, they're just doing the U.S.'s bidding, and I'm like, no, that's not just, like
Hmm.
there's
Exactly.
a history of, the Arab regimes being against the Palestinians,
Yep.
long before, these peace agreements, because of fear of what, with the Palestinian National Project as a left project at one point in time, primarily a left project, what it always kind of threatened, for the stability, for them to hold their rule. And I
Yes.
think that's still fundamentally the case, right? The threat of a good example,
Mhm.
make some strange bedfellows, and that they have their own interests. And I think there has to be a deeper analysis about, you know, um, where all these Arab and Islamic states are really at and what they're trying to pursue, and otherwise you can't make sense of Erdogan and what he's doing and like, why he's intervening and why he's backing the Somali government and kicking up dust with Ethiopia with its trying to open up that support in Somaliland and there's a bunch of different things that's like that's not the U.S. U.S. is not telling Ankara to go open up ports on the in the Red Sea, and that's not the U.S. doing that.
Yeah, yeah,
That's
exactly.
their own thing. That's them doing it at this particular
Yes.
point in time. And so
Yeah.
I think we need to have a much more deeper analysis of all this,
Well,
uh,
and some of it, I think some of it has to do with the kind of reorientation of Saudi Arabia and the Emirates away from the kind of Persian Gulf and oil production towards kind of a post-oil economy, right? How do you do that if you don't have many resources besides oil, right? You colonize, you take over, other places, and maybe not in the same way as we might see the sort of old forms of colonialism or imperialism, but through like controlling networks of production and distribution and so forth. And ports are key to that project, right? I mean, it's essentially what I'm writing my book about, and sort of how Sudan kind of features into that. And I wanted to say, in the case of Palestine, I mean, the case of Palestine and protests and so forth, sort of authoritarian Arab regimes have long, including Sudan, have long used Palestine as a sort of symbol for repressing their own forms, like internal forms of dissent, right? So, like both redirecting dissent towards kind of that, right? So they'll be all about like, allowing people to protest. I mean, there's plenty of examples of this, and I don't like countries like Tunisia, for example, right? Where they'll be totally fine with you going out on the streets with a Palestinian flag,
right.
down with the Zionists, but you do that in relation to their own government, and you're off the street immediately and imprisoned, right? So the same, you know, in the middle of this war, Al-Burhan, I think, went on TV at some point and started, you know, calling out, I think, you know, the IOF and like sexual violence and so forth as it was happening in Sudan, you know. So it often gets used as that. And I think that is, and we all know this in the Arab world. I think in the Middle East, North Africa, in Africa, as you know, on the continent more generally. But I do think it's important to actually name and challenge that, right? Because ultimately, yes, a liberated Palestine, whatever that might look like, right, is going to shift the relationship between the Middle East and Africa. It has to necessarily. And they don't want that. You know, the relationship between the Gulf states and Sudan would look very different if we had a liberated Palestine. And some of that has to do with Israel's role historically as a kind of counter-revolutionary force in also separating, for example, North Africa and so-called sub-Saharan Africa, right, around the question of Palestine, and really thereby undermining any kind of revolutionary, the sort of Casablanca group politics, right, of sort of revolutionary solidarity and like economic and political cooperation, right? That was partly Israel. And so I think, anyway, to me, yeah, these Arab states are very much implicated, and we don't name it enough. They might not be implicated in the same ways, but they certainly are, you know? Yeah.
Well, I was trying to encourage comrades early on in October and like November, was saying this is the time to start protesting in the U.S. against the Arab regimes.
Yep, exactly.
That was part of what I was protesting, but you know, you got to start with yourself first, and what you can bring to bear. So,
But it can
get
be
me
both,
back
right?
towards. Well, you know, but it was like, you know, it's hard to, in fairness to comrades, it's hard to be like, okay, Kali, you know, we hear you. That's more complex, as you know, than just saying and doing. Because what would happen to certain folks' families back home, knowing how that plays out, etc. You
I
know,
know that
you know,
yeah.
but
But that's where
go
we
on, go on.
need more than just Sudanese people on the streets.
Right.
That's what is going to make the difference. If they see non-Sudanese people protesting in front of the UAE embassy, that'll be different from if they see a bunch of Sudanese people. Because yes, they do retaliate. They'll end up sending people home, right? And in the middle of a war where some people like myself, right, are some of the only wage earners in their families that are, you know, sending money home. So I mean, this is partly why we've taken such a long time to kind of mobilize around this, because that is a fear. But I'm convinced, especially like let's say we have a Palestine Sudan protest. We go from the US embassy to the UAE consulate, right? And make the links. I think that's what we need to be doing more of. You know, and then they see a mass of people who have never shown up to a Sudan protest before, and now they're having to, and they have PR companies that are working on this, right? That's partly why we don't see much in the media, right? They have people. There's an Israeli ex-intelligence officer based in Montreal. He has a PR firm called Dickens and Madsen that has been representing the RSF and by extension the UAE, right? And they do this kind of dirty work. So why not protest in front of his, you know, PR company in Montreal? And people have done it, but it's like a small group of Sudanese people. Nobody's going to listen to us really, you know? So anyway, yeah, it's
No, that's that's so I've taken what folks have said to heart about we need a left piece in the U.S. So I'm getting myself in gear and trying to get rally some other folks
yeah.
about we've been doing our mass work, like Cooperation Jackson, but um, I'm ready to get back into a different type of organizing. Definitely, the last 2 years have pushed me, and hopefully others in that direction. And I think this period, I'm like you. I think the I've been very inspired, and by the level of particularly young folks who've kind of taken on Palestine, because it's opening up their minds to so much. That they're going to have to start really questioning the system. The circumstances are forcing them to, like, they're not listening to us. Like, yo, they were never listening to you. But now what are we going to do about it?
Yeah,
You
yeah,
know.
exactly. Yeah,
So,
it's true.
but anyway, I don't want to hold you that too much longer, Nisreen. Thank you so much for this. We will get this piece out probably within the next 48 hours. I just got word that the one from Muzan just finished while we were talking, downloading. So we'll have yours up probably by no later than Monday.
Okay.
Uh, I'll wait to put that up by Monday, just so it's just not languishing out there over the weekend, and try to get hers out tonight and tomorrow. And then we're going to do one more, probably two more of these actually about the Sudan.
Okay.
Folks have been asking for more. You know, there's a lot more viewership on them, and they're getting some decent circulation. I think we're going to get them on Black Revolution Network. You know, for some broader exposure. And I know BAP has been doing a lot to get these out.
Mhm.
But we're going to do one more about ABA, you know, in August. So everybody be on the lookout for that.
Let me know about that. I would want to hear, I would want to listen in on that. Yeah.
Yeah, you know, so we just as a side note, Cooperation Jackson was a fiscal sponsor for like an evacuation response effort with an organization called DECRO for the IBA and getting folks out there.
Okay.
So we've been quietly trying to play our little
Mm-hmm.
part, you know, in some things where some folks, you know, came to us and asked that we do
Yes.
something. So, trying to be good internationalists
Yeah.
as we were taught
Thank
and
you.
trained to do. So, I'll let you know and let everybody know so we can get that out there and get some good exposure for that.
That sounds good. Okay. Thank you
All
so
right.
much. I really appreciate you. Take care. It was
Take
good to
care.
talk. Bye.
Thank everybody.